In the world of football, where legends are measured by titles and match-defining moments, Nwankwo Kanu carved his name through a journey that was both brilliant and unique. He is one of the very few players in history who has touched nearly every highest peak of world football, winning the UEFA Champions League with Ajax Amsterdam in 1995 when he was still very young, claiming the Premier League title with Arsenal, and lifting the FA Cup multiple times in his career, including the victory with Portsmouth in 2008. On the international stage, he was part of the Nigerian national football team that won the Olympic gold medal in 1996, one of the greatest achievements in African football, defeating powerhouses like Brazil and Argentina. Kanu was also named African Player of the Year twice, becoming a global symbol of talent, technique, and uniqueness. With a height of nearly 2 meters, but a rare softness in ball control, he created unrepeatable moments, including the legendary hat-trick against Chelsea in 1999, a performance regarded as one of the greatest comebacks in the history of the competition. The titles, the goals, the cheers elevated him to the status of a legend, a man millions believe was born to shine. But behind all that glory lies a truth no title could ever cover. His heart was never built to withstand those pressures. At the age of 20, when his career had just begun at Inter Milan, Kanu received a diagnosis that could erase everything in an instant. A serious heart defect, a risk that could take both his career and his life. Open-heart surgery was not just a medical procedure, but a gamble between existence and disappearance, where no one could guarantee he would return, let alone play at the highest level. After the operation, he was no longer the player the world once knew, but a body struggling to relearn how to move, a person who had to live with the fear that every heartbeat might be the last. On the pitch, every run was no longer simply tactical, but a challenge to the body that had once betrayed him, every match carrying a silent question: am I still strong enough to continue or not? Without complaint, without long explanations, Kanu chose silence and kept moving forward, carrying pain no one saw, facing the fragility of life without ever stepping back. And it was precisely in that silence that his will became clearer than any words, as he not only returned to football, but continued to live, continued to play, and continued to exist in a world he had almost no longer belonged to. If the story of a heart that once stood on the brink of stopping but still kept fighting makes you pause, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so we can dive deeper into this journey together. In the next part of the journey, you will see how a child who quietly endured from the very beginning shaped the willpower that helped Nwankwo Kanu not collapse before fate. In a place far from the bright stadiums and roaring stands, Nwankwo Kanu's childhood began in deprivation that no later title could ever erase. The red dirt roads, the crowded neighborhoods, and the days when food and clothing were constant worries formed the first backdrop of his life. There, football was not a dream nurtured by plans or guidance, but simply a simple game among children trying to forget reality. An old ball, sometimes made from rolled-up pieces of cloth, was enough to pull him out of the feeling of being limited by circumstances. With no proper shoes, no coaches, no one standing outside the touchline to cheer, only bare feet running on hot ground and uncontrolled collisions. But it was precisely in those conditions that he learned how to keep balance, how to control the ball in tight spaces, and most importantly, how to keep going even when nothing was favorable. Amid the noisy laughter and arguments of the kids, Kanu chose a quieter position for himself. He was not someone who talked much, nor someone who always tried to prove himself. There was something in him from very early on that leaned toward observation, toward understanding the rhythm of the match, rather than trying to dominate it with words. When he had the ball at his feet, he did not rush, did not hurry, but moved as if he were used to waiting. That silence did not make him completely forgotten, but it also did not make him the center, and it seemed that did not bother him. In a world where attention is hard to hold, He learned how to exist without needing it. That gradually formed a strange habit, enduring without needing anyone to witness, striving without needing anyone to acknowledge. His family was not a complete one in the usual sense. There were not many choices, no excessive protection, but there was one thing always present: discipline. In an environment where everything could easily slip out of control, keeping a stable rhythm of life became the most important thing. Simple rules, small responsibilities in daily life, all contributed to building a foundation whose value he would only later realize. No one taught him how to become a great player, but life forced him to learn how not to stay down for too long. When he fell on the hard dirt pitch, he did not have time to lie there because the match continued. When he was hit, he did not wait for comfort because no one really stopped to care. Everything happened fast, and if he did not get up by himself, he would be left behind. There were days when fatigue came earlier than joy, when his small body had to face demands beyond its strength. But instead of resisting, he seemed to accept it as a natural part of life. That acceptance was not surrender, but a way to exist without wearing out too quickly. He learned to keep everything inside, not letting emotions spill out, not letting weaknesses be seen. That made him different, but it also isolated him in a way not everyone noticed. While other children sought attention and recognition, he gradually got used to not needing them. He understood that in a world like that, your value does not lie in what you say, but in how long you can keep going. The long afternoons with football became rare moments when he felt free, not because he was better than everyone else, but because that was when he could forget the limits around him. But even in those moments, he still did not completely let go of control. Every run, every touch carried caution, as if he were used to not being allowed too many mistakes. That caution later became part of his playing style, but at that time, it was simply the natural response of a child who had understood early that life does not allow too many second chances. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is not that he overcame a difficult childhood, but the way he adapted to it without making any noise. No rebellion, no actions to draw attention, only a long process of acceptance and continuation. And that very process quietly prepared him to face much greater challenges in the future. Challenges no longer about material shortages, but about the limits of his own body. When his heart later became the greatest threat to his existence, the habits formed from childhood, the silence, the persistence, the ability to endure without being seen, became the only thing that kept him standing. Not because he was stronger than others, but because he had learned how not to collapse when he was still too young to fully understand what that meant. Leaving Nigeria was not a carefully prepared decision, but more like a step with no turning back, where behind him was everything familiar but limited, and ahead was a vast world but completely unfamiliar. When Nwankwo Kanu set foot in Europe, he did not only bring a vague dream about football, but also the silences that had formed from childhood. The habits of endurance that had become so deep, they turned into instinct. Everything around him changed too fast, from the cold climate to the fast-paced life, from the familiar red dirt roads to modern cities where everything operated by rules he had never known. Joining Ajax Amsterdam was not just an opportunity, but a challenge far beyond anything he had experienced. A place where talent alone was not enough, where every smallest detail was scrutinized, and where weakness had no place to exist. In such an environment, the differences became clearer than ever. Language was a barrier, culture was a gap, and the feeling of being lost was always present every day. The people around him might not intentionally make him feel alien, but the difference was unavoidable. In the locker room, in training sessions, even in the simplest moments, he still had to learn to adapt to a world where everything operated differently. There were times when the silence that had helped him survive in Nigeria became a gap hard to fill here, when not speaking out made him even more isolated. But instead of trying to change himself to fit in quickly, he chose to observe, just like he had done since he was a child, quietly understanding how everything worked before finding his place. On the training pitch, everything was no longer as simple as street football. The speed was faster, the demands were higher, and mistakes could no longer be easily overlooked. The players around him were properly trained, had solid technical foundations, and were used to pressure from early on. In that environment, every training session felt like a test, where he had to prove he deserved to be there, not only to the coaches, but also to himself. But those years of deprivation before actually became an advantage in a way no one could see immediately. He did not panic when things got difficult, did not lose his calm when under pressure, and did not give up when facing initial failures. Instead, he continued, little by little, adjusting, learning, and adapting, just like he had done throughout his childhood. Gradually, the efforts began to bring results. The first minutes of playing time, though limited, were enough for him to feel he was moving forward. The delicate ball controls, the situations where he read the game better than others, started to draw attention. Not through noise, not through big statements, but through the way he played football. And in a team like Ajax, where talent was always discovered and nurtured, he began to find his place. Success did not come immediately, but it came in a steady way, step by step, just like the way he had existed from the beginning. However, behind those positive signs was something no one, not even himself, could recognize at that time. His body, which had helped him overcome so many challenges, was carrying a hidden risk that had not yet been detected. There was no clear pain, no warning signs strong enough to make him stop, only fleeting moments of fatigue, uncomfortable feelings that he learned to ignore, just like he had ignored so many things in life. When his career began to open up, when the future finally seemed clearer, he had no idea he was approaching an event that could erase everything. At an age when many people were still looking for opportunities, Kanu had begun to touch the first peaks of European football. The titles, the big matches, the chances to play at the highest level gradually became reality. But it was precisely in that seemingly most stable period, when everything finally seemed to be heading in the right direction, that a truth was quietly forming, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. And when it appeared, it would not only interrupt his journey, but also force him to face a question he had never prepared to answer. Could everything he had built disappear in just one moment or not? The seemingly slow progress before began to accelerate in a way that even Nwankwo Kanu himself was not ready for. At Ajax Amsterdam, famous for nurturing and polishing young talents, he was no longer just a name that needed to prove itself, but gradually became part of a team heading toward the greatest peaks of European football. Training sessions were no longer just challenges to survive, but became the foundation for his development, where his delicate ball control, tactical thinking, and calmness in high-pressure situations began to be taken seriously. When playing opportunities came, he did not make noise, did not try to steal the spotlight, but let what he did on the pitch speak for itself. And that was exactly what made him gradually stand out in the eyes of those watching. The 1994 to 1995 season became a milestone that not many players his age could reach, when Ajax marched straight to the UEFA Champions League title. It was not just a title, but confirmation that he had stepped into the ranks of players who could compete at the highest level. In a squad full of excellent names, he was not the most outstanding, but he was an indispensable part, a piece that brought balance between technique and composure. When the final whistle blew and the prestigious trophy was lifted, he stood there as part of history. A boy who once came from the red dirt roads, now touching a peak many only dared to dream of. But it was precisely that moment, when everything seemed settled, that opened a new phase with pressures he had never faced before. His name was no longer confined to one club or one competition, but began to spread beyond borders, becoming the pride of African football. With his striking height and rare, soft playing style, he was seen as a symbol of difference, proof that players from undervalued football backgrounds could still reach the top. But along with that recognition came an invisible burden, when every time he stepped onto the pitch, it was no longer just representing himself, but also carrying the expectations of an entire region longing to affirm its position. Pressure did not come immediately, but seeped in gradually through each match, each comment, each look. What had once been pure joy with the ball now became responsibility, became the duty to maintain form, to meet expectations, to prove that success was not just a fleeting moment. In such an environment, maintaining stability required not only skill, but also mental endurance that not everyone had. And for someone already used to silence like him, those pressures were not shared, not released, but kept inside, accumulating over time. While his career continued to rise, his body began sending signals that no one really noticed. They were not clear pains that forced him to stop, but only fleeting feelings of fatigue, moments of breathlessness, times that took longer to recover after each match. In an environment where pushing limits was considered normal, those signs were easily overlooked, not only by those around him, but by himself. He was used to enduring, used to not letting small difficulties stop his steps, and therefore he continued as if there was nothing to worry about. His career at this point looked like a straight line going up, with bigger opportunities, higher challenges, and a future that seemed clearly defined. Invitations and interest from big clubs began to appear, opening new doors he had never thought of before. Everything showed that he was on the right path, that his efforts had been rewarded, and that past difficulties were just stepping stones for what was coming. But even in that seeming stability, something was still not truly solid. What he had built, no matter how impressive, was still based on a foundation he had never fully examined. His heart, which had beaten steadily for so many years, was still taken for granted, something not to be questioned. No one asked about it, no one thought it could be the biggest weakness in this entire journey. And perhaps that very lack of doubt made the coming shock even more cruel. When everything did not collapse gradually but came suddenly, without warning, and without giving him time to prepare. At the moment when everything seemed to be going in the right direction, when he already had in his hands what many people had to spend their entire careers searching for. A truth was waiting to be revealed, a truth not related to skill, not related to tactics, but related to his very ability to exist. And when that truth appeared, it would not only interrupt the path he was on, but also force him to look back at his entire journey under a completely different light, where success was no longer the most important thing, but whether he still had enough time to continue or not. The new door opened when Nwankwo Kanu left Amsterdam to join Inter Milan, a move that for many young players was a clear sign of stepping into the highest tier of European football. The new city, the new colors, the new expectations, all seemed to confirm that the path he had taken up to that point was right. There, everything was bigger, faster, and harsher, but it also meant the opportunity to stand alongside the best names in the world. The first days passed in the familiar rhythm of a professional player, medical checks, completing procedures, preparing for the new season. No one thought that those seemingly formal first steps would become the sudden stopping point of a rising journey. The initial medical examination was no different from what he had experienced before, but the deeper the tests went, the atmosphere around began to change in a way hard to describe. The exchanged looks between doctors, the repeated questions, the silences that lasted longer than usual, all created a feeling of unease he had never felt so clearly. And then, the truth was spoken not in a loud way, without drama, just slow explanations, but carrying enough weight to collapse everything. A serious heart defect, a problem that could not be ignored, a risk that could make continuing to play impossible. In that moment, football was no longer the focus. The titles, the matches, the plans for the future suddenly became distant, as if they belonged to someone else, another life. At the age of 20, when everything should have just been beginning, he had to face a reality no one had prepared him for. It was no longer a question of form or position on the pitch, but a question of whether his body was safe enough to continue existing in an environment that demanded such high intensity as professional football. What had once been seen as the most solid foundation, his own body, now became something that could not be fully trusted. The doctors did not talk about the next matches. They talked about risks, about possibilities, about the limits he had to accept. And in those words, one thing gradually became clear. The road ahead no longer looked like what he had imagined. The feeling of disorientation did not come immediately like a big shock, but spread slowly, gradually, like a gap opening that could not be filled. Training sessions were postponed. Conversations with the coaching staff became cautious. Looks were no longer certain, all contributing to a new reality he was forced to face. He was no longer a player on the rise, but became a question mark, a risk no one knew how to handle. In an environment where efficiency and results were everything, uncertainty was rarely accepted, and he, even if unwilling, became the embodiment of that uncertainty. The following days were no longer measured by minutes on the pitch or goals scored, but by examinations, conversations with doctors, decisions that needed to be made about whether to continue or not. Every choice carried a price, and none was truly easy. Continuing to play could mean putting himself at greater risk, but stopping meant accepting to give up everything he had built so far. Between those two possibilities there was no clear answer, only prolonged consideration and the feeling of being trapped between two paths that both led to loss. In moments like that, memories of the days before did not bring the comfort people usually think. The red dirt roads, the street football matches, the years of silent endurance, all appeared not as a source of strength, but as a reminder of how far he had come, only to possibly lose everything in one moment. There was no clear anger, no strong reactions, only a familiar silence, deeper and heavier, as he tried to understand what was happening to himself. The final decision no longer lay in ambition or desire, but in the ability to exist. Surgery became unavoidable, not to improve performance, but to preserve life. When he stepped into the operating room, he did not carry thoughts about unplayed matches or untitled trophies, but a much simpler question. Could he come back or not? Not come back to the pitch, but come back to life as before, where everything was still considered normal. From that point on, the goal was no longer to become a better player, but to overcome the limits his body was setting. What had once been taken for granted now had to be regained little by little. Breath, heartbeat, ability to move, all had to be rebuilt. No longer something readily available, and in that process, he gradually realized that the journey ahead would no longer resemble anything he had experienced before, because this time, the opponent was not a team, but the very fragility of his own body. There were no more training sessions, no more sounds of boots touching the grass, no more familiar sounds of the locker room. Everything around Nwankwo Kanu was suddenly replaced by a completely different space, where life was measured by each heartbeat displayed on the screen, and the future was no longer counted by seasons, but by the ability to survive a high-risk surgery. The operating room had no audience, no bright lights, only cold white light, and people he had to place full trust in, even knowing the outcome was never guaranteed. When he was brought in, everything happened quickly but felt endlessly stretched in perception, as if time was pulled tight between 2 points no one could clearly define, before and after. He was no longer a player preparing for a match, but a body lying still, waiting for a decision made outside his own will. Open-heart surgery was not an experimental choice, but the only path left. Explanations about the procedure, the risks, the chances of success were all spoken with necessary caution. But behind them remained an unchangeable truth. There were things no one could control. When the anesthesia began to take effect, when consciousness gradually drifted away, he did not carry images of the pitch or victorious moments, but a strange feeling where everything seemed detached from reality. There was no cheering, no pressure to perform, only a prolonged silence where his own existence became more fragile than ever. When he woke up, the world did not return as before. There was no clear transition, no moment marking that everything had passed, only a heavy, weak body and a feeling of strangeness with himself. Simple movements became difficult. Breathing was no longer natural, and every motion reminded him that he had just been through something not everyone could understand. The first days after surgery were not marked by clear progress, but by new limits, where sitting up, walking, or even breathing deeply all required support and time. There was no more rush, no familiar pace, only the slowness that had to be accepted. The hospital space separated him from everything that had once defined his life. Football, matches, plans, all seemed set aside, not because they were no longer important, but because they were no longer within reach. Conversations around him no longer revolved around tactics or form, but about the recovery process, about the small steps he had never thought about before. Time was no longer measured by match days or training sessions, but by hours of rest, times of checks, and waiting periods between health assessments. Each passing day did not bring certainty that tomorrow would be better, but only carried the hope that things would not get worse. In that quietness, thoughts began to appear more clearly, no longer obscured by the busy pace of life before. The possibility of not being able to return was no longer a distant assumption, but became a real possibility that needed to be faced. No one gave a definitive answer, no guarantee that everything would return as before, only open-ended statements, cautious recommendations, and a gap he had to fill himself with his own thoughts. For someone who had once defined himself through football, facing the possibility of losing that was not just losing a career, but losing a part of himself. The days stretched in the hospital had no climax, no sudden turning points, only the repetition of small things, waking up, checking, resting, waiting. But it was precisely in that repetition that something gradually formed, not certainty, but the ability to accept. Not acceptance in the sense of giving up, but acceptance that the road ahead would be different, that what he once saw as obvious now had to be regained little by little. It was no longer about becoming a better player, but about being able to return safely, being able to walk without feeling the body resist, being able to breathe without fear. The silence in those days was not emptiness, but a space where he was forced to face himself in the most direct way. There was no noise to distract, no external responsibilities to avoid, only repeating thoughts, unanswered questions, and a gradually clearer awareness that everything had changed. And in that change, he could no longer return to the starting point, could no longer continue as if nothing had happened, but had to find a new way to keep existing. When looking back, there may not have been any specific moment marking the shift, no single day when everything suddenly became clear, but gradually, in the stillness and limits, something still continued. It was not full recovery, not an immediate return, but a slow process where each step was small but meaningful. And it was precisely in that process that he began to understand that the journey ahead would no longer be measured by what he achieved, but by how long he could continue, in a body he could no longer take for granted. When the hospital doors gradually closed behind him, the outside world did not stop to wait for Nwankwo Kanu to return, and that was perhaps what made everything colder than any physical pain he had just endured. Football continued. Leagues still went on. Teams still played with the same harsh rhythm as before, as if his absence had never existed. The matches he could once have taken part in now became moments he could only follow from afar, without the direct feeling, without his heartbeat sinking with every ball movement, only a gap that grew clearer between him and the world he once belonged to. While he learned to stand up after surgery, learned to walk with a body not fully recovered, other players kept advancing, kept improving, kept taking positions he had once hoped to hold. At Inter Milan, where it was once seen as a big step in his career, his role gradually faded in a way that needed no explanation. There was no official announcement saying he was no longer important, but everything around gradually changed in that direction. Training sessions no longer revolved around integrating him into the squad. Tactical plans no longer counted on his presence as a sure factor. In an environment where performance was the only standard for survival, the inability to guarantee fitness became a minus that no one wanted to mention but everyone understood. He was no longer a central part in the team's thinking, but became an uncertain option, a plan people considered but could not fully trust. The feeling of being left behind did not come from a single event, but accumulated through each day. Each small detail that, if looked at separately, might not matter, but when put together, formed a clear picture. Other players were given more opportunities, trusted more, built around, while he had to wait, had to prove, had to convince that he could still contribute. But while he tried to close that gap, the gap continued to widen. Not because he did not try, but because the pace of professional football does not allow anyone to stand still for too long. What he had built at Ajax was no longer enough to secure his place, because in this world, the past does not hold the future if the present does not meet the requirements. Doubt was not always spoken out loud, but it was present in the way people looked at him, in the way decisions were made. No one wanted to bet on a player whose body could betray him at any time. No one wanted to build long-term plans around an uncertain factor. And even without clear rejection, he still felt that the trust given to him was no longer complete as before. Conversations with the coaching staff became more cautious. Opportunities were offered with more conditions, and every time he stepped onto the pitch was no longer simply playing, but a test of his ability to exist in that environment. In moments like that, the silence that had once helped him through childhood now became a gap hard to fill. He was not someone who sought comfort, nor someone who showed disappointment outwardly, but that did not mean he did not feel what was happening. Seeing others move forward while he was stalled did not create clear rivalry, but created a feeling of distance, as if he was standing on the edge of a flow he no longer controlled. And in that flow, being swept away was not a distant scenario. Gradually, a truth became unavoidable. His position was no longer certain. In football, there is no place for uncertainties, and when a player cannot guarantee his physical condition, he becomes someone who can be replaced at any time. New names appeared. Other options were considered, and he was no longer a priority on the list. There was no intentional cruelty, only the logic of an environment where every decision was based on efficiency. But it was precisely that normal aspect that made everything harder to accept, because there was nothing to protest, nothing to argue about, only a reality he had to accept. In that situation, the question was no longer how to return to the peak, but whether there was still any path to continue or not. Not the path he had once imagined, but any path that allowed him to still be part of football, still be able to step onto the pitch, still be able to feel the ball under his feet. Things that were once seen as big goals now became luxuries, and smaller things, like being able to play and contribute, became worth pursuing. But even when accepting that, the feeling of being replaced did not easily disappear. In a world where everything happens quickly, slowing down means being left behind, and being left behind does not need official confirmation. It showed through the growing distance between him and what was happening, through his name being mentioned less, through his presence no longer being something expected. And it was precisely in that distance that he began to understand that if he did not find a way to change direction, his story could end in the quietest way, not with a big failure, but by gradually disappearing from where he once belonged. As time gradually passed after the long days in the hospital, Nwankwo Kanu began to return to football, but not in the state he once knew. The body that had once taken him to the peak now became a system he had to relearn from the beginning. Every movement, every breath carrying caution. The first training sessions were no longer the familiar excitement, but a series of limits that kept appearing, forcing him to stop, adjust, and accept that he was no longer like before. Every time he stepped onto the training pitch at Inter Milan, he not only faced the invisible opponent of top-level football, but also faced his own body, something he had once trusted completely but now contained uncertainty. Even simple exercises became challenges. Short runs made his heartbeat rise faster than normal. Light collisions were enough to bring back memories of the risks that had once existed. There was no longer fluidity in movement, no longer the feeling of the body reacting naturally as before. Every training session required monitoring, adjustment, and sometimes unexpected stops. While his teammates advanced at the familiar pace of professional football, he had to learn to listen to his body more than any tactical instruction, and that created an invisible gap, not only in fitness, but also in confidence. The worry about recurrence never disappeared. It did not appear as a clear fear, but as a thought that always existed at the edge of consciousness, seeping into every quiet moment. Every time his heart beat faster than normal, every time the body reacted strangely, a part of him was forced to wonder whether it was just normal fatigue or a sign of something more serious. No one could answer for him, and no one could feel it except himself. The silence inside his body became a constant pressure, not loud, but prolonged, making every action on the pitch carry an extra layer of meaning. Not just playing, but verifying whether he was still safe or not. Pressure came not only from within, but also from the surrounding environment. In a big team like Inter, where every position was fiercely contested, returning after heart surgery was never easy. No one said outright that he no longer fit, but every decision reflected clear caution. Playing time was limited. Opportunities no longer came naturally, and every time he was fielded became a real test. He understood that he was no longer seen as a sure choice, but as an option that needed continuous evaluation. And in that context, proving himself was no longer a short-term goal, but a requirement that stretched on with no known end. In training sessions, he often faced a hard-to-describe paradox. The more he tried to prove he was fine, the more his body reacted in ways that forced him to be even more cautious. Good moments mixed with unexpected limits, creating an unstable state that even he found hard to predict from one day to the next. There were times he felt he had almost returned, but just a small change in intensity was enough to make everything start over. There was no stability, no certainty, only a continuous process of testing and adjusting. The real battle did not take place between him and opponents on the pitch, but between his will and his own physical condition. One side was the desire to return to what had once been his. The other was the unavoidable limits of a body that had been seriously damaged. Willpower pushed him forward, but his physical condition forced him to stop. And between those two poles, he had to find a way to exist without losing himself. There was no clear formula, no specific guide, only patience and the ability to accept that the recovery process never happened in a straight line. There were days when he left the training pitch with the feeling of not knowing whether he was progressing or going backward. There were no clear answers, only vague signs he had to interpret himself. In top-level football, certainty is important. But in his situation, certainty was something that no longer existed. And that was exactly what made every step heavier, because he was not only trying to keep his career, but also trying to keep faith in his own body. Nevertheless, he still continued, not because everything became easier, but because there was no other choice. Every training session, every time he stepped onto the pitch, every moment of overcoming a limit, no matter how small, became part of a journey much longer than football. It was the journey of a person forced to learn how to live with a body that was no longer completely reliable, but still had to rely on it to continue existing in the world he belonged to. After a long period where his body kept setting limits and his confidence was gradually eroded by doubt, Nwankwo Kanu's life once again turned in a direction even he could not predict. At a time when many people began to see him as a player who could not fully recover from the damage, a different decision was made by Arsène Wenger, who saw not only the current limits but also a part of the person that had not yet been lost. It was not a safe decision, nor one supported by the majority, but it was one of the rare moments in football where belief rose above data, and where a person was given a chance not for what he currently was, but for what he could still become. When Kanu joined Arsenal, the atmosphere around him was not filled with expectations like ordinary contracts. Instead, there was skepticism, unanswered questions, and clear caution from outside. Many people did not understand why a club competing at the top would choose a player who had just gone through a serious health crisis, someone whose physical stability was still a big question mark. But in that environment, what mattered was not the past, but the ability to contribute in the present. And that was why Kanu entered a new chapter not as a sure star, but as a gamble. However, unlike previous periods, this time he was not forced to prove everything immediately. There was a rare patience given to him, a period of time to adapt without being pushed into the pressure of having to be perfect. In a football world that usually does not allow mistakes to last long, having time became a luxury. Training sessions at Arsenal no longer carried the feeling of having to fight immediate elimination, but became a step-by-step rebuilding process. He was not required to become his previous version, but was allowed to find himself again in a new way. Slower, but more realistic. This difference lay not only in tactics or environment, but in the way he was perceived. After a long time of being seen as a risk, having someone believe in him created a deeper impact than any physical exercise. In the locker room, in team meetings, in the times he was given opportunities to play, he began to feel something that had almost disappeared before. Trust. Not absolute trust, but enough so he did not have to play in a state of constantly being re-evaluated after every mistake. When playing opportunities came, they did not come as a big event right away, but as a series of small moments, minutes at the end of matches, substitutions, situations that did not require carrying the entire team's pressure. But it was precisely in those moments that he began to find his rhythm again. Not the rhythm of the past, but a new rhythm, where he learned to adjust himself according to what his body allowed. It was no longer about forcing himself back to the old image, but accepting that his current existence also had its own value. The biggest change was not physical but psychological. After a long time living in uncertainty, being trusted created a quiet but powerful release. He no longer stepped onto the pitch with the feeling that he had to prove he was not a mistake, but began to play with the feeling that he still belonged here. That difference, though small on the surface, had great meaning in the way a player operated on the pitch. When the mind was no longer strangled by the pressure to prove every second, the body also had the chance to function more naturally. His playing time at Arsenal gradually became a place where he not only recovered physically, but also rebuilt trust in himself. It was not the complete return of the previous person, but the formation of a new version, made from both loss and a second chance. In every touch of the ball, every movement, he no longer carried the constant fear as before, but instead a calmness that came from knowing he still had a chance. The most important thing was not the minutes played or the goals scored, but the fact that he was no longer completely defined by his medical past. For a long time, his body had been the biggest question mark. But here, it began to be seen as something acceptable, not an absolute barrier. And in that acceptance, a new space was opened, where he could continue his career without having to live in the feeling of constant limitation. From a player who once stood on the brink of disappearance, Kanu stepped into an environment where he was not required to be perfect in order to exist. And that very change did what no surgery or training session could do. It gave him back the feeling that he was still part of top-level football, even though his body had once betrayed him in a way he could never forget. After all the periods of being doubted, limited, and questioned about his ability to exist in top-level football, Nwankwo Kanu finally returned to the biggest stage of English football in the Arsenal colours in the Premier League. But this return was not like any previous return in his career. It no longer carried the feeling of a player seeking a new peak, but carried the image of a person who had stood very close to the boundary between life and disappearance, and now was only trying to hold on to every moment he could still stand on the pitch. Right from the first matches, Kanu's approach to football changed markedly. He no longer played like an ambitious young player who only thought about titles or recognition. Each time he stepped onto the pitch, he felt like he was entering a space he was not sure he would be allowed to return to again. Every pass, every touch, every decision carried an unusual calmness, but inside it was a very clear awareness of the fragility of his body. There was no longer confidence based on a feeling of invincibility, but the focus of a person who understood that everything could change in just one moment. In the Arsenal colours, he gradually found his rhythm again, not by forcing himself back to the old image, but by adapting to a new version of himself. The intelligent ball controls, the ability to hold the ball in tight spaces, and the timely appearances in the penalty area began to create a clear influence. He did not need to play too many minutes, did not need to be the center of the team, yet he could still create value every time he was given the opportunity. That was exactly what helped him gradually regain trust, not in a noisy way, but through stability and efficiency. But behind every match was a truth that only he fully felt. He was no longer playing with a completely healthy body. Every warm-up, every acceleration came with tight control, as if he always had to keep part of his body in a state of alertness. There was no longer the natural fluidity as before, but instead calculation, timing choices, and restraint in every movement. This did not make him weaker, but made the way he played football different, slower but deeper. Then one of the most important moments in his Arsenal career appeared, when he scored a hat-trick against Chelsea, a match that not only fans but the entire football world still talk about. It was not simply 3 goals, but a statement that his story had not ended. In a match where everything happened at high speed and under great pressure, Kanu appeared at the right time, in the right place, with almost absolute coldness in every finish. There was no excessive emotional outburst, no long celebrations, only moments of completing the task, as if he had become used to turning the smallest opportunities into the most meaningful things. The most special thing in his period was not the number of goals or minutes played, but the way he changed the way he looked at himself. Before, he had been defined by potential, by expectations, and by what others thought he could become. But after everything he had been through, he no longer needed that. He played not to prove that he was a big star, but to prove that he could still exist in the harshest environment of top-level football. Each time he stepped onto the pitch, he no longer carried the pressure to be the best, but simply to do the best he could at that moment. This change made him dangerous in a very unique way, because he was no longer controlled by external expectations, but only focused on each specific moment. In a league where everything happened very fast and very harshly, his calmness became a different kind of strength. However, nothing in this journey was completely stable. His body was still a factor that could not be fully predicted, and every match still came with certain limits. But instead of letting that define him, he learned to live with it. It was no longer the question, can I return to how I was before, but how long can I continue in the current version? And that very question changed the entire way he existed in football. From a player who once stood on the brink of disappearance, Kanu became someone who played not for fame or recognition, but for the very moment of being present on the pitch. And in every match at Arsenal, he was not only playing football, but also proving that sometimes a return does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be enough to keep existing. After all the incidents that seemed like they could end his career, Nwankwo Kanu once again stepped onto the grass in the colors of the Nigeria national football team, carrying not only personal ambition, but also the hope of an entire country looking for a symbol to believe in. But this time, he was no longer the young man playing just for glory or titles. He was a person who had once stood between the boundary of life and death, someone who clearly understood that every touch of the ball could be the last one. In international matches, especially at the 1996 Olympics, where Nigeria created one of the greatest stories in football history by winning the gold medal, Kanu did not just play as a player. He became the center of a collective carrying the pride of all of Africa. The victories against big teams like Brazil or Argentina were not just sporting results, but moments that changed the perception of African football on the world map. And in all those moments, Kanu was an irreplaceable part. Not because he was always the top scorer, but because his presence brought balance, calmness, and belief. But behind that glory was a truth that only he felt most clearly. His body was no longer a completely reliable foundation. After the heart surgery, every international match was not only a technical challenge, but also a test of survival limits. When he put on the national team jersey, he faced not only opponents, but also his own silent worry that his body might not react as expected. No one in the stadium saw that. They only saw a player with delicate technique, skillful ball control, and intelligence in every touch. But inside, every movement came with a silent calculation, a continuous control to ensure he could still continue. The pressure from Nigerian fans was something that could not be measured in numbers. For them, Kanu was not just a player, but a symbol of hope, of the ability to rise from difficulties. Every time he stepped onto the pitch, millions watched, not only hoping for a victory, but also hoping for confirmation that Nigerian football could stand alongside the world. And that was why, every time he played, he carried not only personal responsibility, but also the expectations of an entire nation. But that did not reduce the physical burden he had to endure. On the contrary, it made every limit heavier, because he knew that stopping would affect not only himself, but also many people behind him. There were matches where he stepped onto the pitch feeling his body was not completely stable. But he still continued to play because he did not want to betray the trust of the team and the fans. He did not always reach his highest form, but he always tried to maintain the necessary presence. In important situations, he did not need to run the fastest, but always chose the right position. Did not need to score the most goals, but always contributed to the decisive moments. That was exactly what made him an important part of the Nigerian national team during this period. However, the truth was that no match in this period took place without a trade-off. Every time he played was a time he had to listen to his body more than usual, had to accept that he could no longer play football in the carefree way as before. Recovery sessions after matches became more important than ever, not to prepare for a new peak, but only to ensure he could continue to stand firm. And in all of that, the hardest thing was not physical strength, but accepting that his limits had changed. Nevertheless, it was precisely in that pressure-filled period that Kanu left his deepest mark in the national team colors. He was not just a player, but the image of resilience, of a person who had once stood at the most fragile boundary of life, but still chose to return to continue playing. And in every run on the international pitch, he carried not only the ball, but also his own story. A story about continuing to exist in a world that never stops to wait for anyone. After the years playing in the national team colors, when the cheers had died down and the national pressure temporarily gave way to club life rhythm, Nwankwo Kanu began to enter a phase that few people saw clearly. The phase where the body was no longer something obvious, but became a part that had to be controlled, monitored, and sometimes doubted. The heart surgery that had once saved him not only left a mark in his medical records, but also left a long-term change in the way he existed with football itself and with life. After the surgery, nothing returned to the way it was, even though on the outside he still played, still scored goals, still appeared on big stadiums. Inside, the body no longer reacted the same as before. Long training sessions became heavier. Recovery ability was no longer as fast as in the early days of his career, and every acceleration came with an invisible caution. He could no longer step onto the training pitch with absolute freedom, but always carried a silent layer of control, as if every movement needed to be considered more carefully than usual. In the top-level football environment of the Premier League, where speed and intensity were always high, those limits were not always easily accepted. There were matches where he felt he had to adjust the way he played, not because of lack of technique, but because the body no longer allowed continuous explosion. Strong collisions, situations requiring immediate reflexes, all became moments where he had to calculate instead of reacting completely naturally. And that very change forced him to learn to exist in a different way in the same harsh environment. The pain was no longer a clear incident, but became a prolonged state. It did not appear like a specific injury, but like a silent presence in the body, sometimes clear, sometimes just a prolonged feeling of fatigue after each match. There were days he left the pitch with the feeling of uncertainty about how his body would react the next day. No one could see that from the outside. To the world, he was still a professional player, still playing, still contributing. But inside, every day was a process of rechecking his own limits. In training sessions, he was no longer someone who could participate in every exercise at the highest intensity unconditionally. There were times he had to adjust, had to stop earlier, had to choose different approaches to avoid exceeding the body's limits. This did not make him lose value, but forced him to continuously adapt. His career was no longer built on the foundation of physical perfection, but on the ability to maintain presence even when it was not completely whole. The hardest thing was not the change in playing, but accepting that the body could no longer be trusted absolutely. After the surgery, every unusual sensation could become a question. Every fatigue could carry worry. It was not always real danger, but uncertainty always existed. And in professional football, where stability is the key factor, living with that uncertainty was a prolonged challenge. Nevertheless, he did not stop, not because everything was easy, but because stopping meant giving up the entire journey he had been through. He continued to play, continued to train, continued to appear on the grass as a familiar part of English football. But the way he existed in that world had changed. He was no longer a player who relied only on physical strength or speed, but became someone who used experience, positioning, and understanding of the match to compensate for the new limits of his body. His persistence no longer took the form of explosion, but became a silent form of endurance. There were not many words, no grand statements, only continuation. Continuing to train even when the body was not perfect. Continuing to play even when not in optimal condition. Continuing to be present in an environment that never slows down. And that very continuation became the clearest mark of his in this period. Over time, people no longer looked at him only as a player who had gone through a medical incident, but as a person who had learned to live with it, not completely overcoming it, not erasing it, but adapting. In every match, every season, he proved that a career is not only defined by perfection, but also by the ability to maintain it under non-ideal conditions. And even though the pain never really left, it no longer stopped him. It became a part of the journey, a part of the body, and a part of the way he continued to exist in football. After many years living with the limits left by the surgery, Nwankwo Kanu began to look back at his journey not only as a football career, but as a series of lucky times overcoming the boundary of life and death. And it was precisely from that awareness that a different direction gradually formed, no longer related to titles, no longer related to the pitch, but related to the children who were standing where he once stood, between life and the risk of disappearance. From his personal experience, he clearly understood the feeling when a not completely healthy heart could decide the entire future of a person. He understood the feeling of lying in the hospital, facing doctors talking about risks, while the future became more vague than any match he had ever experienced. And that very memory became the foundation for a turning-point decision, establishing the Kanu Heart Foundation, an organization created not from fame, but from the memory of the fragility of life itself. The goal of the foundation was not simply medical support, but to open up the chance to live for children with congenital heart disease in Africa, those who, if not given timely intervention, might never have the chance to grow up. Heart surgeries, which had once been the most haunting experience in his life, now became something he sought to bring to others. But this time, it was no longer fear, but hope transformed into action. The early days of the foundation were not easy, not because of lack of ideas, but because of skepticism from the surrounding world. In an environment where football is often viewed through titles and achievements, a player moving into the medical and humanitarian field was not always properly understood. But Kanu did not start from recognition. He started from memory. Every child supported was not just a case, but a reflection of himself in the past, when everything could have ended very early if there had not been a second chance. Gradually, the Kanu Heart Foundation began to create real impact. Successful surgeries not only saved children's lives, but also brought belief to their families, those who had once thought there was no way out. Hospitals, doctors, and medical organizations began to connect with the foundation, expanding the scope of activities beyond Nigeria, spreading to many other areas of Africa. Every life saved became a new story, no longer tied to tragedy, but tied to continuation. What was special about Kanu was that he did not only play a symbolic role. He participated directly, followed each case, met families, and witnessed the children being given back the chance to live. In those moments, he was no longer the player who had played in the Premier League or the person who had worn the Arsenal shirt, but became someone who had once clearly understood the feeling of standing between the boundary of life and death, and now was standing on the other side to pull others back. The connection between personal experience and charitable work was not only symbolic, but the real foundation of the entire organization. Every sponsored surgery carried the memory of himself in the past. Every child saved reminded of the journey he had once been through. And that was exactly what made this work never become a side activity of life, but a natural continuation of his own person after football. Over time, Kanu's influence was no longer limited only to the field of sports. He began to be seen as a figure with social impact, a person who used personal experience to create real change, not through words, but through concrete actions. Each surgery, each child, each family given back hope. And what was most important was that what he did not stop at a short-term campaign, but became a journey lasting many years. When looking back, his football career is still remembered with titles, moments with the Nigeria national football team, or matches in Europe. But alongside that, another legacy has formed. A legacy not measured by goals or championship cups, but by the number of lives saved. And in all of that, what makes Kanu's story special is not who he became in football, but what he did with the chance to live that he himself had almost lost. After many years of dedication, both in football and social activities, Nwankwo Kanu's life entered a completely different phase, where the noise of the stadium gradually faded away and the rhythm of life became slower, quieter, and also deeper. There was no longer a dense match schedule, no longer continuous flights between countries, no longer the pressure to prove himself in every match, and he began to step into a world that before he had rarely had time to feel: life after football. After retiring, Kanu did not choose to continue appearing heavily in the media or keeping a central role in top-level football activities. Instead, he gradually withdrew from the spotlight, appeared less in public, and spent more time with his family. For a person who had once lived in an environment where every action was watched and every decision was analyzed, living in quietness became a significant change. It was not disappearance, but the choice of a different rhythm of life, where value was no longer measured by attention, but by peace. Family life became the new center in his world. Simple moments, unrelated to football or fame, gradually took a more important place than any match before. Time for loved ones, conversations uninterrupted by match schedules, and full presence in personal life became something he had rarely had before. If in the past everything revolved around preparing for the next match, now everything revolved around building a more stable and sustainable life. This change did not happen suddenly, but was a gradual transition process. After many years living in a highly competitive environment where everything happened at high speed, adapting to slowing down was not always easy. But the experiences he had been through, especially the health incidents and the periods facing the boundary of life and death, made him look at life in a different way. Stability was no longer something obvious, but something to be cherished. In the years after retirement, Kanu no longer appeared regularly on sports pages as before. Instead, he only occasionally appeared in symbolic football events or charitable activities linked to the Kanu Heart Foundation. His presence in these events was not ostentatious, but like the natural continuation of a journey that had begun long before. He was no longer the center of attention, but still an important part of the community he once belonged to. His daily rhythm became simpler, but not empty. There were no more high-intensity training sessions, no more playing pressure, but there were still activities with their own meaning, meetings, social projects, and especially time for family. After many years living under the tight control of professional football, being able to decide how to use time himself became a new form of freedom, a freedom that was not noisy but sustainable. What is noteworthy is that even though he had left the pitch, football did not completely disappear from his life. It still existed in stories, in memories, and in the way he looked at the world. But instead of being the center of existence, football now became a cherished part of the past. The matches in the Premier League, or the moments in the Arsenal colours, are now looked back on, not with pressure, but with the calm of a person who had been through it all. In the quietness of the new life, Kanu found a kind of balance that before he had rarely had the chance to experience. No longer pulled by the expectations of millions of people, no longer having to face the physical and mental pressure of top-level playing, he could look back at his journey with a broader perspective. What had once been the biggest challenges now became memories, and what had once been pressure now became lessons. That balance did not mean everything became completely easy. His body still carried the traces of the years of playing and the heart surgery, reminding him of the fragility that had once existed in his life. But instead of becoming an obsession, it became a reminder of the value of living slower, of cherishing every present moment. And that was exactly what made his life after retirement not an ending, but another form of continuation. Less noisy, but deeper. In the eyes of the public, Kanu may no longer appear as often as before, but in real life, he is living a stage that many people in professional sports find hard to achieve, peace after a journey full of incidents. And that is perhaps the greatest reward life gives to a person who had once stood at the most fragile boundary of life, but still chose to continue moving forward. In the long journey from the red dirt roads of Nigeria to the bright stadiums in Europe, Nwankwo Kanu's life was never a simple straight line. It was a series of times that seemed about to end, but then continued, as if his very existence was always placed in a state of challenge between stopping and going on. When looking back at that entire journey, what stands out is not only the titles, but the fact that he is still here, still continuing to live, still continuing to contribute, even though at many points in life he had stood very close to the boundary of disappearance. His career was once interrupted by an incident that not every player could return from, a serious heart problem discovered when he was still very young. In that moment, football was no longer a question of skill or future, but became a question of life. Open-heart surgery was not just a medical procedure, but an absolute test of the ability to exist. There were times when returning to the pitch seemed impossible, not because of lack of talent, but because the body could no longer be considered completely reliable. But it was precisely in that situation that he returned, not as a person protected from risk, but as a person who accepted to live with it. When he returned to top-level playing, especially in the Arsenal colours in the Premier League, Kanu was no longer a player seen only through potential, but became a symbol of endurance. He was not always the one who played the most minutes, not always the tactical centre, but every time he appeared, he brought a special value. That was the ability to change the course of the match through short moments, through intelligence, and through experience gained from the hardest periods of life. His career was not only defined by goals or titles, but also by the way he existed in an environment that never forgives uncertainty. While many other players could rely on stable physical condition to maintain form, Kanu had to learn to play in a state that always had a part limited. That made every match not only a sporting task, but an affirmation that he still had enough ability to continue existing in the world of top-level football. But if we only look at the playing career, his story would not be complete. The more important part of this journey lies in what happened after the final whistle, when he stepped out of the stadium lights and moved to a completely different role in society. Through the Kanu Heart Foundation, he began a new journey, where the goal was no longer to score goals or win, but to save the lives of children who faced circumstances similar to what he had once faced in the past. His contributions to the community were not merely symbolic activities. They were real surgeries, real lives saved, real families given back hope. Every successful case was not just a number, but a story reflecting his own journey. If in the past he was the person lying on the other side of the operating table, now he was the person helping others get through that very moment. What is special is that this transition did not make him completely leave football, but expanded its meaning. From a player, he became a person with broader social influence, where value lay not only on the pitch, but also in the long-term impacts on the community. He is no longer remembered only through matches, but also through the lives he helped change. When looking back at the entire journey, the image of Kanu is not the image of a person who always won, but the image of a person who always continued, continuing after injury, continuing after surgery, continuing after doubts, and continuing even when the body no longer guaranteed perfection. That very continuation creates the deepest essence of his story, a story not defined by perfection, but by the ability not to stop. In the present, when life has become quieter, he still carries within him the traces of everything he has been through, but is no longer defined by them. He is not only a former player, not only a football legend, but a person who has gone through limits that many people never have to face. And the most important thing is not how many titles he achieved, but that he is still here, still continuing to live, still continuing to contribute, and still continuing to be proof that there are lives written not to end early, but to prove that existence is sometimes the greatest victory. Looking back at the entire journey of Nwankwo Kanu, people did not only see a brilliant football career, but also see a life that always stood between the fragile boundary of life and disappearance. From the open-heart surgery at the age of 20, when his career seemed to have ended before it could even begin, to the moment he returned to top-level playing in the Arsenal colours in the Premier League, then left his mark with moments like the hat-trick against Chelsea. All of it is not just a story about talent, but a story about a person forced to learn how to live with the greatest fear of his own body. The sad thing is that while the world sees the goals, the titles at the 1996 Olympics or the European Cups with Ajax Amsterdam, behind that is a body that was always under supervision, a heart that could have stopped at any time. His career was not built on stability, but on the prolonged endurance of a person who continuously had to prove that he could still exist. But it was precisely in that adversity that Kanu's value became more special. He not only overcame illness, but also turned the life and death experience into motivation to save others through the Kanu Heart Foundation, where hundreds of African children were given the chance to live thanks to the heart surgeries he sponsored. That is the transformation from a person who once lay on the operating table to a person helping others not have to face it too early. In the context of American culture, Where the pressure for success is often tied to fame and achievements, his story reminds us that true value sometimes lies in the ability to stand up after times that seemed impossible to continue. The lesson drawn is not only about sports, but about how people face their own limits. Kanu shows that persistence is not always loud, but sometimes is quietly continuing to live when the body and fate guarantee nothing. For American audiences, where many people are chasing quick success and competitive pressure, this story reminds us that the greatest strength is not never falling, but still choosing to stand up even knowing one is no longer perfect as before. And sometimes, the greatest legacy does not lie in what we win, but in the lives and hope we give back to others after having once been saved ourselves. If the story of Nwankwo Kanu's journey overcoming the boundary of life and death has touched your heart, please hit subscribe so we can continue exploring the stories behind the stadium lights together. Thank you for accompanying us, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to tell the journeys of resilience, loss, and hope that never goes out.